Hello there, I'm Aileen Carroll, sommelier with Lynfred Winery. Thank you so much for joining us for our Winemaker's Reserve virtual guided tasting kit featuring some of our most premium reserve wines. So today we have for you our 2018 Reserve Chardonnay, our 2013 Reserve Petite Sirah, and our 2015 Reserve Cabernet Sauvignon. So these are our reserve wines because they have received extra special attention and extra premium winemaking techniques as applied by our Director of Winemaking, Andres Basso, as well as our head winemaker, Rodrigo Gonzalez. So we'll be explaining throughout the course of this tasting those premium winemaking techniques that go into producing these reserve wines, and you'll be able to directly see, smell, and taste the direct effects as to how these different winemaking choices and techniques affect how a wine ends up tasting. So those techniques are going to include the use of oak in the aging process, as well as the difference between American oak and French oak, as well as other premium techniques like surly aging and batonnage. So one thing you'll be able to do by the end of this tasting is also be able to identify, just by sight, smell, and taste, how to pick out a wine that has been aged in oak, as well as understanding the effects of the other premium techniques that I'll be explaining for you today. Before we dive right into the wines, I want to lay out a quick framework of the 3 different factors that go into affecting how a wine ends up tasting. So first, of course, we have the grape itself, all the unique characteristics that are just inherent in that particular varietal, its colors, aromas, and tastes. Next, we have all the geographic and climatic factors that affect how a grape tastes, because, for example, a wine grown in California is going to taste different than a wine made from grapes grown in France. And the fancy French word for this whole concept of the climate and weather and soil and how that affects wine is terroir. So that's the second aspect that affects how a wine tastes. Then thirdly and finally, and what we'll be focusing on today, are all of the winemaking choices that the winemaker makes in the process of producing a wine, such as whether to age it in oak or stainless steel, what type of oak to use, whether to use processes like surly aging and batonnage. So that'll all be great because we'll be able to actually see, smell, and taste the effects of these different processes. So, diving right into wine number 1, we have our 2018 Reserve Chardonnay. And as you can see right away, it has a really rich, deep golden color to it. And that's characteristic of any white wine that has been aged in oak, because there's the ever so slight presence of oxygen, since oak is wood, is porous, and that ever so slight oxidization will cause a deepening and darkening in color in a white wine that has been aged in oak. So look for that. Moving on to how it smells. We've got a lot of rich fruit flavor, definitely a lot of rich tropical fruits like pineapple, banana, a little bit of like baked yellow apple as well. Now, in this tasting, we're going to want to focus a lot on the non-fruit smells and flavors, because that's the category of flavors and aromas that's going to allow us to pick out the effects of oak aging and the different types of oak use, because all of these wines are aged in oak, giveaway. And we're going to be wanting to pick out different nuances of type of oak, age of oak, but I'll get into all that later. Let's go back to the non-fruit smells, and then we're going to taste our first wine. So you're definitely going to notice a rich, buttery kind of smell, as well as a more subtle vanilla. And then, of course, we're still smelling all the tropical fruits. And then I also want you to see if you can pick up on a kind of toasted almond, almost like sweet, nutty aspect to the smell. I've kept you waiting long enough. Let's have a sip of our Chardonnay. So we're definitely tasting those tropical fruits I mentioned. The pineapple, banana. I'd say mostly the tropical fruits are coming through of the fruits on the actual palate. And then in terms of the non-fruit tastes, the vanilla is definitely very apparent. You can even kind of taste that almondy quality. And then there's kind of a subtle spice to it as well. Not like red pepper chili spice, but like clove, allspice, cinnamon. In the wine world, we call that set of spices baking spices, like spices you would bake with. So remember that we tasted those. And then of course there's that rich buttery taste as well as a creamy texture, which we'll find out are kind of two cool separate things. So I gave away that we have oak. We're going to talk about the type of oak. We're going to talk about what causes that creamy texture to it. That's its own winemaking process. So we've got a lot of different interesting technicalities going on just in this Chardonnay, but you can just sit back and continue to sip and relax and enjoy, and I'm going to simply and easily to understand explain to you all these different techniques and how they affect the taste of the wine. Hopefully I'll do it simply and easy to understand. All right, so as I go through and explain, I want you to keep 4 different flavor groups kind of separate, because there's going to be a different aspect of winemaking techniques that cause each of these 4 different categories. So first we have vanilla and kind of that oaky quality, for lack of a better word. Secondly, we're going to focus on the baking spice category. Then we're going to separate out our buttery aspect from our creamy aspect. So we have like the vanilla and oak, we have the baking spice, we have the butter, and then we have the cream, and there's a different aspect of winemaking technique that causes all 4 of those different flavors. So to begin, I laid out those 3 different factors of what affects how a wine tastes, and that's interesting, especially when it comes to Chardonnay, because there's so much variation in the way that Chardonnay is produced. You can have unoaked, oaked, different kinds of oak, different lengths of aging, no aging. So Chardonnay is a really great example to hone in on how all these different techniques affect how a wine turns out. So we're going to begin with the vanilla and kind of toasty category. I did already let you know that all these wines are aged in oak, but just like different kinds of grapes have different main inherent characteristic flavors and aromas, so do different kinds of oak. So the main 2 types of oak that are used in aging wine are American oak and French oak. And those are distinct in a couple of different ways. So American oak, we're going to see really, really bold flavors of vanilla and oak and toast, whereas with French oak, we're going to have a lot more subtle vanilla, as well as more of a kind of sweet, nutty, toasty quality and those baking spices that we were talking about before. So the reason that American oak has so much more robust flavors as compared to French oak is that American oak is a much looser grain of wood. The grains of it aren't as dense, whereas French oak is really tightly packed. So imagine like a really, really dense sponge in comparison to a loose sponge. The dense sponge is not going to have really a lot of room for any liquid to move around through it, whereas the looser sponge, the American oak, the looser grained wood, is going to leave plenty of room for interaction between the wine that's aging in the barrel and the wood itself. So that's why American oak is going to impart much stronger vanilla flavors than the French oak. So that said, returning to our Chardonnay, we're going to try to see if we can pick out whether it's aged in American oak or French oak. So if it's aged in French oak, we're going to get more subtle vanilla, that baking spice quality of kind of clove and allspice, as well as those sweet toasted notes, whereas the American oak is going to be really, really aggressive vanilla and oak. So I would say, but then of course I already do know the answer, This is more in the subtle, nutty, less bold vanilla category. And in fact, our Chardonnay is aged for 8 months in French oak as opposed to American. One thing I didn't mention before about the difference between American and French oak is the price. So the average French oak barrel is going to cost more than $1,000 minimum for just one barrel, whereas American oak costs about $400 a barrel. So only the best for our premium Reserve Chardonnay for you. So in addition to deciding whether or not to use American oak or French oak, a winemaker also has to make the choice of whether or not to use new or old oak. So as you may or may not know, oak barrels that are used for winemaking are toasted when they're fresh and new, just like a new barrel that's made for aging bourbon. So obviously the difference between how a new oak barrel and an older oak barrel tastes is that the new freshly toasted one that's never had any wine in there before is going to really have bolder flavors, whereas a wine barrel that has already been used to make wine before is going to have way more muted flavors. Returning again to our Chardonnay. Would you say that the oak flavors that we are picking out there, the baking spice and the vanilla, are they pretty prominent or are they almost imperceptible, more muted? You're correct if you said that they're pretty perceptible. Again, this is aged in new French oak, the most premium kind of oak that can be used to age wine. And then returning to the sort of different flavors we were trying to pick out, I already said vanilla comes from oak generally, and that baking spice quality is going to be especially apparent when you have new French oak like we have in this one. So we've explained the first 2 out of the 4 flavors and winemaking techniques that we were interested in this Chardonnay. We have the vanilla from oak itself, and then specifically the baking spices coming from new French oak. The next thing we're going to want to talk about is butteriness, because most people associate this so much with Chardonnay that we tend to maybe think at first that the butteriness is an actual quality of the grape itself, as opposed to the actual truth, which is that it comes from winemaking choices that happen later on. So, the winemaking choices that go into the production of this buttery flavor involve something called malolactic fermentation. I already explained how when a white wine is aged in oak, there's a little bit of oxidization that happens because oak is porous and a little bit of oxygen gets in there. So this does have the effect of deepening the wine in color, but it has a different, separate effect of allowing a process called, as I had said, malolactic fermentation, or ML for short. White wine, when it's young and new and hasn't been aged, has a lot of malic acid. That's the kind of acid that's found in like a tart, unripe apple skin, you can imagine. And when the wine is aging in the barrel and has a little bit of exposure to oxygen, there's a natural bacterial reaction that occurs that converts the malic acid, which is tart, into lactic acid, which is the kind of acid found in dairy, which is kind of smooth and creamy. And if bacteria sounds gross, think of like smooth, creamy yogurt. That's made with bacteria too, so that's not weird. Also, it's really good beer made with bacteria, but that's not our subject for today. So, an additional byproduct of malolactic fermentation, besides just converting the tart malic acid into smoother lactic acid, there is an additional chemical compound produced by this process called diacetyl. Diacetyl is the exact same compound that is naturally found in butter, which gives it its characteristic buttery flavor. So the butter that you're tasting in Chardonnay isn't in the grape at all. It's the result of this winemaking technique that allows this buttery flavor to come out in the aging process naturally. But again, not in the grape itself. So anyone who keeps going on talking about buttery Chardonnay should know that's coming from our third category of things that affect how a wine tastes. It's all down to the winemaker when it comes to bringing out that nice, rich, buttery flavor that I know so much of us love in our Chardonnay. So we've explained the vanilla comes from oak, we've explained the baking spice comes from new French oak, we've explained that malolactic fermentation gives us that buttery flavor that only leaves the wonderfully creamy texture of this Chardonnay to explain. The process that contributes to this wonderfully creamy texture is called batonnage. Let's back up and just briefly recap how a wine is made. So we know that to make wine, you take grapes, you press them, you add yeast, and then the yeast eats the sugars in the grape juice and converts that to alcohol. Now usually when that yeast is done eating all the sugar, it's filtered out right away because it's dead. It doesn't have any more sugar to eat. It's already done the whole alcoholic fermentation process, and a winemaker will usually filter it out right away. But a winemaker can choose to leave this already used up, or yes, technically dead yeast in with the wine in the barrel to hang out for a while and impart some of the yeasty flavor of what's called the lees to the wine. So to just leave that in there is called sur lie aging, or aging on the lees. And I know that all sounds a little bit weird, but think of that really nice, creamy, rich flavor and texture of like a brioche bun or a croissant. Now, leaving the yeast in there doesn't sound so weird, and it'll sound even less weird to know that a winemaker can additionally choose to periodically stir the lees back up into the wine as it ages along with the lees. And that process is called batonnage, which is really just a fancy way of saying stirring in French, but that's what's giving us the delicious creamy flavors and texture that we're getting in our Chardonnay. So I know there's so much technical information that I just laid out there for you, but really the cool thing about it all is that it should really deepen your appreciation of all the amazing expertise, attention, work, and love that go into making a premium wine. And the other cool thing is that maybe you're seeing that you really liked the creamy aspect of it, and you can go out and look for more Chardonnays that have batonnage. Or maybe you realize that you really, really love that buttery component, and now you can sound fancy to all your friends and explain malolactic fermentation. Just kidding. What you can do is go out and look for more Chardonnays that have that same process applied to them. Because again, this isn't just about learning about these processes for their own sake. It's about giving you the tools and knowledge to go out and find more amazing wine that's right up your alley. There's no like right or wrong answer. It's about using this knowledge of wine to find more of what you enjoy. So I know we covered a lot of ground, but I've pretty much laid out all of the winemaking techniques that we're going to talk about. So we just get to sip and apply what we've already learned as we taste our next wine, which is our 2013 Reserve Petite Sirah. So the grapes for this Petite Sirah come from Clarksburg, California. It is of course 2013 vintage, and we do have 100% Petite Sirah here. Sorry, I'm getting ahead of myself. So Petite Sirah is an American synonym for a French grape that was originally called Durif. Some people don't know that most of the most popular grapes that we encounter, including Cabernet Sauvignon, I'll get to that later, but also including Petite Sirah, are actually crossbreeds of other older types of grapes. So all wine grapes are technically the same species, Vitis vinifera, but just like all domestic dogs are technically the same species, there's plenty of different variation among the unique breeds. They have unique characteristics, and you can, cross them and get interesting effects like the nowadays popular Labradoodle and whatnot. But returning to the Petite Sirah, so in the 1860s, a French botanist named Francois Durif decided to see what would happen if he crossed a Syrah grape with a lesser-known indigenous French varietal called Pelor Sang. And the result is Petite Sirah, or what he called Durif, but we know in America as Petite Sirah. So, looking at the color of this wine, it's pretty dark and dense, honestly. However, I will give you a little hint that a normal young Petite Sirah is not, is actually even more dark and dense in color as this. So opposite of white wine, as a red wine ages, it actually loses color, whereas a white wine deepens and darkens in color. And if you're not familiar with what a young versus old version of a particular varietal of red wine looks like, one trick that you can do is turn the glass against a white, not sequined gold backdrop and see if you can spot any variation in the color from like the core in the center to what we call the rim on the exterior. If the rim is a much lighter color and is even like almost fading to white or clear, I should say, then that's going to be indicative of some age on a red wine, and you can know that just by looking at it. So that's going to be how you identify signs of aging in a red wine. Let's remember everything that we were talking before about oak and dive into the smell of this. A lot of really delicious, rich blue and black fruit like blackberry, blueberry, definitely plum. But again, of course, we know we're going to want to be focusing on the non-fruit flavors because that's where we're going to find our evidence of oak, what type of oak, etc. So obviously, we have some amount of toasted oak going on, specifically vanilla. I wouldn't say too much toasted nut, really just kind of like a predominant vanilla toasted oak aspect that almost is like a bit caramely. A bit of espresso, like sage. It's really amazing. We'll wait till we taste it to decide if it's French or American. Let's dive right in. So, you might think that this is a little tiny bit like astringent, but it's actually pretty darn smooth for a Petite Sirah. How aging affects a red wine, besides allowing the color to get a little bit lighter, a little more substantially, what happens is that the tannins in the wine, that bit that makes your mouth feel kind of astringent, gets softened by being aged in oak. So let me do a little sidebar and explain. The term tannin and the term dryness tend to get confused very often. So to explain all that, think of dryness as only being a quality of taste. And all dry means is that a wine doesn't taste sweet. That's it. That's all it means. Now the reason that dryness tends to get confused with tannin is because tannin is not a taste component really, it's a textural component. So that's how I want you to think of them to keep them distinct. Dryness is an aspect of taste, whereas tannin is a function of texture. And again, the reason they get confused is because tannins make your mouth feel dry. But keep thinking of it as a textural quality and you'll be able to keep those definitions distinct. So when a red wine gets aged in oak, the little bit of oxidization that's allowed in there allows those tannins, which are initially quite aggressive and astringent, to soften over time. Almost imagine like a slow cooker. The slow little trickle exposure of oxygen when a red wine is in an oak barrel is like a slow, even kind of cooking out of those astringent tannins, and we get much more smooth, much more velvety and round mouth feeling. So this is pretty darn smooth for a Petite Sirah, let me just say. So returning to our little detective work of whether or not we have American oak or French oak, and whether or not we have new or old oak, let's focus on those non-fruit qualities of the taste. Now, we said there was definitely some robust vanilla, definitely a lot of robust, toasty, woody, almost like a caramelized wood taste that we have going on here, which is amazing, if I might just say. So would that put us more in the camp of the robust American vanilla, or the more subtle baking spice French category with those subtle nutty aspects as well. I don't know if you were getting a lot of baking spice. I really wasn't. This is definitely classic American oak. That really, really nice, bold, smooth vanilla is coming through really strong, as are those toasty qualities. So that leads us smoothly into our next little deductive question of, is it new American oak, or is it oak that's already been used once before and the flavors are more muted? I think this one should be pretty easy. The vanilla flavors we already mentioned are really bold, as are the toasted oak qualities to it. And if you said that this was new American oak, you're actually doubly right. How's that, you ask? This Petite Sirah is so reserved that it's double oak aged. What that means is that our wonderful winemakers put the freshly fermented Petite Sirah in brand new American oak barrels, and it hung out there for 24 months. That's 2 years that it aged in brand new American oak. But that wasn't enough wonderful time and attention and love put in there. They took that wine that had already been aged for 2 years in American oak, transported it to other separate brand new American oak barrels, and it stayed in there for a whole another year before being bottled. Isn't that so cool? Like, I think that's mind-blowing. I mean, maybe it's just all this premium wine going to my head, but I don't think so. I think that all of this knowledge really should deepen your appreciation of how much interesting expertise, knowledge, and passion goes into producing these reserve wines. So, last but not least, our 2015 Reserve Cabernet Sauvignon. Before we dive right into the sight, smell, and taste, I had briefly mentioned before that just like Petite Sirah, Cabernet Sauvignon is actually not an original type of grape, but it's a crossbreed between two other kinds of grapes. The first parent of Cabernet Sauvignon is a French grape called Cabernet Franc, and you'll literally probably not believe what the second parent grape is, unless of course you already know it. It's a white grape. It's Sauvignon Blanc. Cabernet Franc and Sauvignon Blanc had a little grape baby, and it's Cabernet Sauvignon, which is literally the most popular grape in the whole world. It's certainly the most widely planted. So, enough technical detail. I know I've given you probably more than you expected. Let's dive into this Cabernet. So, as I mentioned with the Petite Sirah, a red wine is going to lose a little bit of color as it ages, and I think we can probably tell that this Cabernet is a little bit lighter in body and color than some of the newer, richer Cabernets that we might be used to. Remembering all that we know about oak as we dive into the smell. Really nice smoky black fruit notes. Again, the blackberry, although a little bit lighter, kind of like a black raspberry, I'd say, is distinct in this Cabernet versus the Petite Sirah. We certainly have the vanilla flavors, and we have like so much delicious toasted oak. I'm almost getting like a like old books and kind of a cigar tobacco quality, but in a good way. We're just smelling it. What are we waiting for? Let's taste it. Wow. A lot of herbs going on in there too, in addition to the blue fruit, the black raspberry. We have like kind of an interesting herbal sage quality going on here, and all of those toasted notes are really coming through, like tobacco, cedar, and certainly vanilla, although I'm not quite sure how robust it is. Pretty robust, I would say. Naturally, that leads us into our first sleuthing question. Do we have American oak or do we have French oak? Remembering, of course, that American oak is going to have those really robust vanilla flavors, robust toasted notes, whereas French oak is going to be more subtle, more in the spicy category of baking spices like clove and allspice. So, do you think we have French or American? We do have American oak here. Those vanilla flavors are pretty darn bold, and that toasted quality that's coming through as like the robust, like tobacco, that's kind of more indicative of American oak because it's not like the subtle baking spice. So I keep using the word robust. Let's get on to the question of whether it's new or old. Robust is kind of a giveaway. And if you were already thinking that this is probably new oak, again, you are doubly right. Just like our Reserve Petite Sirah, our Reserve Cabernet Sauvignon is double oak aged, actually for even longer than the Petite Sirah. So after the wine was made, our lovely winemakers put our Reserve Cabernet Sauvignon into brand new American oak barrels where it stayed for 2 whole years. And then, in an act of passion and love, they decided to move it to more separate, brand new American oak barrels where it stayed for an additional 14 months before being bottled. So I really hope that you're seeing how understanding all these technical processes isn't just for the sake of knowledge, it's for the sake of enjoying the wines more and really appreciating how much work a winery and winemakers do put into making these wines, especially, of course, our Reserve wines today. So I know we've put enough hard work into understanding these wines. Let's have a little bit of lighter fun and talk about something I know everybody loves, which is food and wine pairing. Now I know there's of course the general rule of you want to pair white meat with white wine and red meat with red wine, but I would prefer for us to think about food and wine pairing in terms of matching intensity and matching flavors. So here's an example of a potential pairing for our Chardonnay. You're going to decide which one's better. That'll illustrate why we need to get a little bit beyond just colors and think more of intensity. So imagine we have a nice light herb roast chicken, maybe with like a garlic cream sauce, in comparison to a chicken that has been grilled and like covered in aggressive barbecue sauce. Which is going to pair better with our Chardonnay if we're thinking in terms of matching intensity and matching flavor? Definitely the lighter herb roast chicken, because not only are we matching the intensity, we're also matching that kind of creamy flavor of the cream sauce. Now for the barbecue sauce covered chicken, I would almost say that's intense enough to be paired with a red wine. So that shows how it's not as simple as the white meat, white wine, red meat, red wine. You probably want to go with a slightly lighter body red wine, like a Chianti or maybe even a French oaked Pinot Noir with your barbecue chicken. And I want you to keep in mind that difference between the general color rule and the matching intensity rule when we get onto the reds. But other amazing pairings for our Reserve Chardonnay would be any slightly richer seafoods like crab or lobster. There we're matching the intensity and also matching that kind of rich, creamy flavor. Both of our red wines are pretty exceptionally bold, so we're definitely going to want to pair those with foods that are really intense. But I want to say a little bit more about moving away from that simple color rule to illustrate how intensity isn't really a factor of color. So think of cheese. Cheese is mostly white. Yeah, of course, there's yellow cheddar, there's blue cheese, but blue cheese is still mostly white. There's just little bits of blue. So focus on blue cheese in particular, or any really robust aged cheese like an aged Gouda. If you were to pair that with a white wine, really the robust flavors of the cheese would overwhelm your more delicate white wine. So even though cheese is white, we'll say it's white, it's really going to pair best with the intensity of a bold red wine. So blue cheese is going to be exceptional with either of these, or even really like a really aged Asiago would be delicious. A little bit of Gorgonzola, of course, would be another blue cheese. And then in terms of other food pairings for our bold red wines, matching intensity and matching flavor, any grilled or roasted red meat that you could think of, amazing with either of these really. Roast lamb, barbecue ribs, because those all have intense flavors, and then also with the grilled or roasted aspect of them, we're highlighting those nice toasty, caramelized, smoky notes that are present in these double oak aged red wines. So I know that this was a lot of information, but hopefully I made it pretty easy to understand, and I really do hope that understanding all of the work and expertise and passion that go into making wine, especially these reserve wines, help deepen your appreciation of not only our Lynfred wines, but really of all wine. Because as we've learned, it's not just the grapes themselves or where they're grown that makes the wine taste the way it does. It's the artful hand and the expert choices of the winemakers who are actually producing it for you. So if you're interested in purchasing any of the amazing wines that were featured in our Winemakers Reserve tasting today, or if you want to purchase another guided tasting kit, because we have a total of 4, or if you just want to explore the amazing wines that we have to offer from Lynfred, just check out our website, lynfredwinery.com. And remember, even though we may be separate, that's no reason that we can't enjoy a delicious glass of wine together, have a little fun, and hopefully learn something in the process. Cheers. I'll see you soon.